love she didn't plant, by Amelia Winters. Chapter 1, Petals Before Dawn. The sky hadn't yet softened from charcoal to lavender when Alara Winters unlocked the wrought iron gate of Fleur, her flower shop nestled between an old bookstore and a sleepy cafe. She liked mornings like this, the stillness before the world unfurled, the quiet that allowed her to hear her own heart, or at least pretend she could. Alara moved through the narrow corridor of the shop like a gentle current, flicking on the warm lights, passing wooden shelves dressed in dried lavender, eucalyptus garlands, and hand-painted vases. She ran her fingers along the petals of sleeping roses and sunflowers, checking their mood like a mother pressing her hand to a child's forehead. Everything was where it belonged, and yet something felt out of place. She turned toward the front counter to start sorting the new shipment of tulips, but her gaze halted at a single white envelope, delicately placed atop her favorite ceramic pot. No name, no stamp, just the faint scent of jasmine rising from its sealed edge. Alara paused, lips parting slightly. She looked around, though the silence told her nothing had stirred but the wind. She picked up the envelope. The texture was soft, vellum, possibly handmade. She turned it over once, twice, then opened it. The letter inside was handwritten in neat cursive, the ink a warm sepia tone. To the keeper of blooms who forgets to bloom herself. You do not know me. Not yet. But I've seen the way you speak to roses as if they understand you, the way you linger by the lilies longer than you intend. There is a sadness in your smile and a hope in your silence. This is not a poem. This is not a game. This is a beginning. Yours, from somewhere between the ivy and the dust. Alara blinked slowly, as if the words would shift if she stared long enough. Her thumb grazed the edges of the letter. It wasn't signed, not really. There was no return address. Just a tone, a presence. Someone had watched her, seen something no customer ever took the time to notice. She pressed the paper to her chest without quite realizing she was doing it. For a moment, the room seemed to shimmer, not with fear, but with unfamiliarity. She hadn't received a letter like this since, well, never. By noon, the shop had filled with the slow rhythm of customers. An elderly man buying a bouquet of wild daisies for his wife's grave, a young girl seeking purple hyacinths because she read they meant, "Please forgive me." Alara moved through the transactions with a practiced grace, but her mind tugged always toward the envelope, now tucked safely beneath the cash register drawer. Someone looks dreamier than usual, murmured Maeve, her part-time assistant stacking peonies into a vintage bucket by the window. Do I? Alara smiled faintly, adjusting the ribbon on a bouquet. I suppose that's a good thing. Maeve tilted her head. You're not usually dreamy. You're graceful, mysterious. You float more than you walk. Alara laughed softly. And here I thought I was just tired. Maeve, all curls and candor, raised an eyebrow. You're not tired. You're glowing. Did someone finally write you a love letter in the language of hydrangeas? The words struck too close. Alara looked away, but Maeve noticed the faint blush rise to her cheeks. Oh my God. They did. Who is he? Do I know him? Alara shook her head, placing a hand gently on Maeve's shoulder. No one you know, and I don't know him either. At least, not yet. The day faded in golden strokes, and as the last customer left, Alara stood beneath the canopy of twinkle lights above her shop's doorway. The sun had dipped low, setting fire to the skyline in brushstrokes of orange and rose. She held the letter again, reading it a second, then a third time. To the keeper of blooms who forgets to bloom herself. She wondered what that meant. Was it true? Had she forgotten to bloom? She hadn't thought of her life as withering, but maybe it was merely surviving, like a plant in poor light. nourished enough to live, but not enough to flourish. Her thoughts wandered to her past. The years had slipped by gently but firmly, without drama, without climax. Her relationships had been short-lived, like poppies, bright but too delicate to last. Her dreams of traveling to Provence, of opening a second shop by the sea, had all been folded into drawers labeled later. And later never quite came. That night, she placed the letter beside her bed, next to her journal and a cracked teacup she used to hold lavender oil. She didn't sleep easily. Her thoughts pressed petals between the pages of memory and imagination. Who was he? Why now? And most of all, why her? Morning arrived again with the hush of possibility. Elara stepped into her shop with a strange flutter beneath her ribs, unsure what she was hoping for. Another letter? A shadowy figure lingering in the mist? She found neither. But beside the bouquet of chamomile she had arranged the night before was a small box, wrapped in twine topped with a pressed violet. She unwrapped it slowly, cautiously, as if afraid it would vanish if opened too quickly. Inside was a dried rose, perfectly preserved, and a note that read, "A rose doesn't bloom because it must. It blooms because the light calls it to. Let the light in. Still yours." Elara held the box close, heart tight in her chest. There was something about the simplicity, the depth, that made her feel seen. She looked out the front window at the quiet street, bathed in morning light, and whispered to herself, I think, I want to know who you are. Chapter 2: The Language of Lilacs. Elara Winters had always believed that flowers spoke a language more profound than words. Roses whispered longing, dahlias pride, and lilacs sang of first loves and fading promises. Yet none of her beloved blooms had ever spoken directly to her, until now. For the second morning in a row, Elara found herself pausing at the front window of her flower shop, heart thrumming with something between dread and hope. The air was heavy with late spring rain, the streets slick with the shimmer of last night's storm. A breeze carried in the scent of soil and sweetness, like the world had been scrubbed clean while she slept. She stepped into Fleur, her hands trembling slightly as she unlocked the door, heart wondering what it would find. Would there be another note? Another token? There was, nestled between the stems of a lilac arrangement, one she hadn't sold, hadn't moved, was a third envelope. This one was deep violet, sealed with wax pressed into the shape of a small ivy leaf. Elara's breath caught. She hesitated for a moment, hand hovering, the air charged as if touching the letter might jolt something awake inside her. She peeled it open, fingers careful. Lilacs today, because they speak in silence, and I imagine you understand silence better than most. I saw you yesterday pause by the cafe window, brushing petals from your apron. Do you always tend so carefully to what others forget to see? There is strength in stillness, Elara. I wonder if you know that. I'll write again soon, not to pull you into something, but to remind you you're already in it. From the Ivy. Elara. Maeve's voice floated in from the back of the shop, and Elara startled, folding the letter quickly and sliding it into the notebook she kept beneath the counter. Yes. Maeve emerged, holding a bouquet of freesia. You all right? You look like someone left you a poem and disappeared. Elara blinked. That's remarkably specific. Maeve grinned. I have intuition, and a very vivid imagination. Elara smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. I'm fine. Just thinking about lilacs. Maeve narrowed her eyes. Lilacs? You hate arranging them. Too fussy. Elara looked down at the purple blooms on the counter, their scent light but persistent. Maybe I've changed my mind. Later that afternoon, Alara wandered to the antique store 2 blocks down, claiming she needed ribbon, but mostly needing to breathe away from the expectant hum in her chest. As she turned the corner past the bakery, something caught her eye, chalk scrawled onto the side of the alley wall. It wasn't graffiti. It was deliberate, neat cursive, in the same style as the letters. Some flowers grow in shadow and still find the light. She stopped, heart skipping. A message? A coincidence? The writing was fresh, the white chalk untouched by rain. Someone had been here recently. She reached out and touched the wall, fingers grazing the rough brick. Then she stepped back and looked around, but the street was empty, save for a tabby cat sleeping on a windowsill. She returned to Fleur, feeling like the ground beneath her had shifted ever so slightly. That evening, the shop emptied slowly. The last customer, a young man who confessed nervously he'd never bought flowers before, left with trembling hands and a single coral peony wrapped in brown paper. Ilara stood by the window long after, her arms crossed loosely, watching dusk paint the street in melancholic blue. The letter sat open on the counter behind her, whispering its words into the corners of her mind. She poured herself a cup of chamomile tea, the steam rising in curls, and then, as if summoned, she moved to the cabinet behind the counter where she kept her grandmother's old stationery, handmade paper with flecks of dried petals pressed into the fibers. She sat down, took a breath, and picked up a pen. She didn't quite know what she was doing, but she began to write. To the one who leaves ivy where others leave footsteps. I do understand silence. I've lived within it more than I've lived within laughter. I don't know who you are or why you've chosen me, but I know that since your words arrived, something inside me has begun to stir. Thank you for noticing. From the florist who's learning to bloom. She sealed the letter and stared at it, unsure what to do next. She couldn't leave it outside and expect it to find its way. Or could she? She slipped on her coat and stepped into the cool night, letter in hand. The street was quiet, shadows curling at the edges of buildings like ink in water. Across the way, she noticed the old mailbox on the corner, the one no one used anymore, paint chipped, leaning slightly left. She placed the letter inside. Just in case. The next morning, the fourth letter was waiting. It wasn't on the counter. It wasn't by the door. It was inside the bouquet of white lilacs she had left in the shop's front display window. She found it after opening the shutters, the envelope nestled between blossoms like it had grown there overnight. Her hands trembled more than they had yesterday. So you wrote back. I wasn't sure you would. I had only hoped. There's a quiet bravery in you, Alara. One not born from loud declarations, but from the way you keep showing up every day, offering beauty to a world that rushes past it. I've been watching you for some time, not in the way that stories often warn against, but like a painter watches light change across the same hill day after day. There's something here, don't you feel it? Something neither of us planted, but it's growing. From the ivy. Elora pressed the note to her chest. Her heart beat not like thunder, but like rain, persistent, soft, unrelenting. She didn't know where this road led. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to walk it, even if it was paved in petals and questions. Even if she didn't yet know the face behind the words. Even if the love she was beginning to feel wasn't one she had planted. It had somehow planted itself. Chapter 3. Petals Between Pages. There was a time in Alara's life when days folded into one another like the pressed flowers between the pages of her mother's old books, flattened, quiet, unmoving. But now each morning felt like the turning of a fresh leaf, her heart racing slightly in anticipation of what the day might bring. She awoke early on Wednesday, light streaming through gauzy curtains, casting golden stripes on the floor. The scent of rain still lingered in the air, though the sky promised sun. Her hand reached for the bedside table out of habit, brushing against a dog-eared journal filled with half-written flower orders and doodles of petals. But she didn't open it. Instead, her gaze fell on a lilac envelope tucked neatly inside the folds of her scarf from yesterday, another note from the ivy. She hadn't responded this time, unsure how to answer words that lingered too closely to places in her heart she hadn't dared explore. Something neither of us planted, but it's growing. A part of her wondered if she was losing her grip on what was real. Who was this person writing to her with such precision, such clarity of observation? It was like they saw beyond her window smiles and her polite greetings, like they knew the loneliness she had dressed in the scent of roses and the way she talked to flowers like friends. Downstairs in Fleur, the rhythm of the shop returned, gentle and hushed, as if the blooms themselves demanded calm. By mid-morning, she was weaving stems of freesia and lavender for a customer who had asked for something gentle for someone grieving but trying not to cry in public. Alara understood that language. The bouquet came together with instinct more than intent. As the customer left, Alara leaned against the counter, wiping a smudge of pollen from her cheek. Maeve sat perched on the old ladder shelf, legs swinging, reading aloud from a book she'd plucked off the display table. "Listen to this," Maeve said, eyes twinkling. "And perhaps the heart, once quiet, is not truly empty, but waiting for a sound it once knew and forgot how to hear." Alara blinked slowly. "What book is that?" Maeve turned the cover. "Some forgotten poetry collection you stuck behind the lavender candles. I think the universe is trying to flirt with you." Alara laughed softly. The universe has an odd sense of timing. Maeve tilted her head. Not the universe, then? Someone else? Alara didn't answer. She reached instead for the peonies that had just arrived, their petals still tight, as if shy to bloom. Later that day, she returned to the chalk-marked wall in the alley. She'd brought a piece of chalk herself this time, light blue, and stood for a long moment before writing anything. Then, in her neat, looping cursive, she scribbled beside the previous message. "Light finds flowers, even the ones who don't ask for it." She smiled faintly, brushing her hands off. It was strange, this ritual of responding in places no one else would notice, as if the city itself was passing notes in their stead. That evening, as dusk spilled lavender across the sky, Alara found something different waiting at Fleur. No envelope, no note inside a bouquet. Instead, on the front door, tied with a slender green ribbon, hung a single flower. A sprig of forget-me-nots. Tiny, blue, delicate. And there, attached beneath, was a card, no envelope this time, written in the same familiar hand. "I won't always write. Sometimes I will leave you a silence and a symbol. Forget-me-nots, for the memories you tucked away too tightly, for the things you no longer let yourself grieve. I wonder what stories you've never told. I wonder if you'll ever tell them to me." From the ivy. Alara stared at the note for a long time, her breath fogging the glass behind it. She brought it inside carefully, laying the sprig in her drying rack behind the counter, where she preserved petals for pressed art and framed arrangements. But this one she wouldn't press. She wanted to remember how it looked in life, soft and almost hesitant. She sat down, hands clasped in her lap, the shop quiet around her. And then she began to write again. I do have stories. Some I only tell the wind when I walk home alone. Some I've stitched into the hems of old dresses and the folds of aprons dusted with rose pollen. I don't know why your words reach them, but they do. Maybe you're right. Maybe light is finding me. But I've also learned that light sometimes can burn. So I'm listening carefully. I just don't know how to believe in something that grows without a name, without a face. From the girl who plants love for others, but never learned how to keep any of it for herself. She sealed the note, placed it in the same rusted mailbox, and walked home with her arms wrapped around herself, unsure if it was from the cold or the weight of memory beginning to stir. The next morning, there was no note. And the morning after that, nothing. The absence stung more than she expected. She moved through her day with restless hands, trimming stems too short, fumbling with ribbon, losing track of orders. Maeve noticed. You're distracted, she said. Did something happen? Elora hesitated. I think I imagined something too lovely, and now the silence feels like loss. Maeve stepped beside her, taking the scissors from her hand gently. Maybe silence is just breathing space. Doesn't mean it's over. Sometimes the best blooms take their time. Elara smiled faintly, grateful for Maeve's way of knowing when not to press. That night, she didn't expect anything, so she almost missed it. Slipped beneath the door after hours, nearly lost in the dark. A pale yellow envelope. And inside, I missed writing. But I needed to be sure this wasn't just poetry to pass the time. Your last letter, it stayed with me. You asked how something can grow without a name, without a face. I don't have your name on my lips when I pass your shop. I have it in my chest. I don't have a face to show you yet, but I do have truth. And truth, I think, is where love begins. So let's grow something wild, even if we don't know what it's called. From the ivy. Elara didn't cry, but she felt something open inside her. A petal she hadn't known was still closed. Chapter 4. The Language of Leaves. Elara hadn't realized how much her life had leaned into solitude until it began leaning somewhere else, toward wonder, toward possibility, toward someone she'd never seen but somehow already missed when they weren't near. The ivy. She no longer questioned the name. It had become something like a rhythm in her day, a thread between hours, woven in between flower deliveries and whispered laughter with Maeve. The mysterious notes had grown into something more than just a curiosity. They had become a presence, soft and invisible, like sunlight that touches your skin but doesn't ask for attention. And now it was changing her. She found herself watching the way leaves curled toward the light, how petals bent and softened with warmth. She paid more attention to the world when it rained and when it didn't. Silence was no longer empty. It was full of listening. Even her shop, Fleur, began to change. She rearranged displays in softer arcs, set poetry books between plant pots, and kept a tiny chalkboard near the counter with a new flower fact or quote each day. Customers began to linger longer. Smiles stayed a little fuller, a little warmer. One afternoon, she found herself sketching tiny ivy leaves into the margins of her order book, unaware that Maeve had been watching. "You've got that look," Maeve said from behind a pot of African violets. Alara blinked. What look? The one poets have before they confess something, or before they run away with someone whose name they don't know. Alara laughed, but her hands paused. Is it strange to care about someone who's still a mystery? Maeve thought for a moment. Not if they see the part of you that you forgot was there. That's not mystery. That's memory being rediscovered. Alara said nothing, but her smile answered for her. The next letter didn't arrive on paper. It came in the form of a book, left on the shop counter while Alara was helping a customer out back. No note, no signature. Just a copy of The Secret Garden, well worn, its spine cracked but loved. Inside, pressed between the pages, was a single autumn leaf. Bright, crimson, beautifully veined. And in the center of the page, underlined faintly in pencil. If you look the right way, you can see that the whole world is a garden. Alara sat down on the stool behind the counter, her fingers grazing the leaf's edges. She turned the page over. There, hidden beneath the next passage, a line was scrawled in the familiar handwriting of ivy. Some things don't bloom until someone shows them they can. She held the book to her chest and closed her eyes. That night, she walked to the ivy-covered alley wall again, clutching her own note in her pocket. But instead of chalking something for others to see, she sat on the bench nearby and took out her pen and paper. She wrote slowly, each line deliberate. You remind me of the sea, though I've never seen your face. There's a pull in your words, a current, a calm. The kind that reshapes shorelines without ever needing to crash. I don't know who you are, but somehow I think you've already seen the version of me I lost. And maybe I want to find her again too. Alara. There it was, her name. She didn't fold the letter. She didn't hide it in the mailbox. She left it there on the bench, the moonlight falling gently across the page like approval, and she walked home, trembling, but lighter. The next morning, she returned to Fleur earlier than usual. The morning mist clung to the glass, and her hands were still cold as she turned the key. She hadn't expected anything. Not so soon. But there, nestled in the crook of the doorframe, was a tiny, hand-stitched bundle, wrapped in soft cotton. Inside, a paper star, a dried daisy, and a tiny card with delicate ink. Alara. Thank you for your name. I said I wouldn't always write, but tonight I couldn't sleep knowing your name was sitting on a bench under a sky that never deserved your honesty. I will keep it safe now. The sea. You said I reminded you of the sea. But I think you are the shore, patient, unmoving, quietly collecting what drifts in and knowing when to let go. I think I've been drifting for a long time. And now I think I've found the place I'd like to stay. Ivy. Alara stared at the note. her breath catching. It wasn't just a mystery anymore. It wasn't even just a romance. It was a recognition. Someone out there had seen through her silences, had sifted through the quiet corners of her life and offered not just admiration, but understanding. And perhaps something deeper. She opened the shop with a steadiness she hadn't known in months. The day passed gently. A boy came in to buy flowers for his mother's birthday and left with a tulip bouquet and a whispered, "You smell like spring." An elderly woman lingered by the counter and recited a poem Elara hadn't heard since childhood. Maeve made a wreath from rosemary and thyme and said it reminded her of the days before her sister moved away. Elara listened to them all, because for the first time she knew what it meant to be truly heard. That evening, she wandered through the market street on the way home, fingers brushing fresh apples and woven baskets. She stopped by a paper stall and bought a new journal with a pressed lily cover. When the vendor asked if it was a gift, she said no. "It's for the parts of myself I forgot to talk to," she replied. When she reached her apartment, there was no note, no surprise package, just the lingering memory of the sea and shore. But that night, she opened her new journal and began to write, not to Ivy, not to anyone. To herself. About the love she didn't plant, and the one quietly blooming anyway. Chapter 5. Petals in the Rain. The rain came gently that morning, tapping at the window panes like an old friend asking to be let in. Elara woke to the sound of it, her blankets wrapped loosely around her like a memory she hadn't let go of. She lay still, watching the sky weep over the city with grace. No thunder, no storm, just the kind of rain that nourished rather than drowned. And as the drops slid down the glass, she realized something. She wasn't afraid of quiet anymore. The hush of morning used to weigh heavily on her, but now it felt soft, like a lullaby hummed between pages of an unfinished story, a story that was no longer just hers. Ivy. The name bloomed in her mind with ease now, no longer shrouded in mystery, but embroidered with comfort. Whoever they were, they had become a constant, a rhythm in the cadence of her days. It was strange how the absence of a face didn't dull the connection. It only sharpened her awareness of their presence in her life. She pulled herself from bed, brewed a cup of chamomile tea, and pressed her fingers to the spine of the secret garden again. It still sat on the kitchen table, opened to the underlined page. The crimson leaf remained nestled inside, its color fading slightly, but still vivid enough to make her heart ache in the gentlest way. By the time she reached Fleur, the rain had turned into a steady drizzle. The shop looked different in this light, like something out of a watercolor painting. The ivy over the doorway shimmered with droplets, and the blooms in the window bowed gracefully, each petal kissed by the sky. Maeve was already inside, humming something old and French, arranging hydrangeas with meticulous care. She looked up as Elara entered and offered a smile that needed no words. "I brought muffins," Elara said, holding up a small paper bag. "Lemon poppy seed." "Bribery will get you everywhere," Maeve replied, and they both laughed, the sound folding into the quiet harmony of the morning. Later, Elara stepped outside with her umbrella, walking slowly along the alley wall where the chalk ivy still danced in faded strokes. She didn't expect anything today. Ivy had said they wouldn't always write, and she believed them. But then she saw it. Not a letter. A plant. A small terracotta pot sat on the bench, plain, unmarked, but inside was a baby jasmine vine, its leaves damp and fragrant from the rain. Tucked into the soil was a sliver of parchment, curled with moisture but still legible. Not everything I grow thrives. But I saw this and thought of you. Jasmine only opens at night. Like some hearts. Elara ran her thumb gently across the parchment, holding it as though it might dissolve in her hand. She sat on the bench, letting the rain tap lightly on her umbrella while the jasmine vine nestled between her palms like something fragile and holy. A heart that opens in darkness. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was her. She had lived much of her life under a careful hush, giving light to others while saving none for herself. Her flowers had always been the voice she never quite found the courage to use, until Ivy. Until now. That evening, as the sky folded into indigo and the last of the customers drifted out, Elara placed the jasmine pot beside the register, next to the dried daisy and the paper star, a little altar of beginnings. Maeve watched quietly from behind the ribbon shelf. They left something again, didn't they? Elara nodded. Maeve tilted her head, a thoughtful expression shadowing her usual playfulness. Do you think it's time? Time for what? To stop wondering if you deserve to be loved like this. Elara paused. She didn't know how to answer that, not right away, but her eyes stung with a truth she hadn't spoken aloud. I think I've spent a long time tending to the lives of others, she said slowly, and forgetting that my own soil needed care too. Maeve came over and took her hand, squeezing it. Maybe that's what Ivy sees. Maybe they're not just writing to you. Maybe they're watering something in you that forgot how to bloom. That night, Elara returned to the bench with no letter in hand, only a folded piece of soft green paper. She placed it beside the empty flower pot she had brought for her reply and smiled. The rain had stopped. The air was filled with petrichor and peace. She sat for a while before unfolding her note and reading it aloud to the empty alley. Jasmine opens at night, but some of us need more than the moon. We need a reason, a voice. A patient gardener. Ivy, I don't know where this is going. I only know that every time I speak your name inside my heart, I feel less afraid to hear my own. Thank you for teaching me how to listen to silence and find something sacred there. Yours, Elara. She left it there, the folded paper pressed under a smooth stone. The jasmine vine had opened a single bloom when she returned to her apartment, delicate, pale, fragrant. She didn't cry, but something inside her did open. Something soft, something whole. Chapter 6, The Shape of Stillness. The first truly cold morning arrived with a whisper. It didn't shout itself into Alara's bones, it simply crept. The kind of chill that made the air taste like frost and the windows were halos of condensation. She stood at her kitchen sink, watching the city blur beyond the glass. Her breath fogged against it as she rested her fingertips there, tracing invisible patterns, little spirals that vanished as soon as they were made. Winter was coming, and with it, a quiet she had not yet named. The jasmine vine now lived on her windowsill, curling its tendrils eagerly toward the light. 3 blossoms had opened in the last 2 days, their scent lacing the corners of her apartment like a story waiting to be read. Alara had begun to whisper to it in the evenings, almost unconsciously, gentle musings, half-spoken thoughts, moments she didn't even share with Maeve. She never expected the jasmine to answer, but sometimes it felt like it did. Fleur had slowed down. With autumn nearly finished and the first hint of frost curling at the leaves, fewer people wandered in from the street. Those who did came for the comfort of warm colors, golden chrysanthemums, dusty roses, and pale eucalyptus wrapped in soft brown paper. Maeve had started knitting behind the counter between customers. She was working on a scarf, the color of antique books, soft browns and olive green. When asked who it was for, she simply smiled and said, "Someone who doesn't yet know they need warmth." Alara loved her for that. But her own mind was elsewhere. It had been 4 days since the last letter from Ivy. The silence was not entirely unexpected, but it stretched differently this time. Heavier. Not painful, but contemplative, like standing on the edge of a still lake and waiting for a ripple. Alara had placed another letter in the alley 2 days ago, sealed with a pressed marigold. It remained untouched. She reminded herself, Ivy had said the letters wouldn't always come. But when silence grows, it starts to resemble absence. That evening, after closing the shop, she didn't go to the alley. Instead, she walked aimlessly through the quiet neighborhoods beyond the market street. The trees here were older, their branches twisting overhead like ancient conversations. Lights blinked softly in the windows of terraced houses, golden glows flickering through lace curtains, and the silhouettes of strangers eating dinners she'd never tasted. She didn't feel lonely, but she did feel distant from something, from herself. By the time she made her way home, her coat was damp at the shoulders and her hands stiff with cold. Still, the apartment welcomed her like always. The jasmine greeted her with its heady perfume. But tonight, she didn't whisper to it. She stood at the windowsill, fingers brushing the soft petals, and closed her eyes. There was something in the stillness, not emptiness, but shape. As if the silence Ivy left behind was not a void but a form. Something she was meant to notice, maybe even grow into. The next morning, she opened Fleur earlier than usual. Maeve wasn't due in for another hour, and the city still slumbered beneath a gray sky. She brewed tea, tied her apron, and began arranging the new delivery of amaryllis and wax flowers. Then she heard the bell above the shop door chime. She turned, expecting a customer. But no one stood there. She frowned, walked to the door, looked outside. And then she saw it. A small white envelope taped to the glass just below the shop sign. There was no handwriting on the outside, no flower pressed in, no name. She peeled it gently from the window and brought it inside, her hands trembling just slightly as she slid her finger beneath the flap. Inside was a note. The lines were shorter than usual, the handwriting a touch uneven, still Ivy's, but not as careful. It felt raw. I stayed away because I needed to know if you were drawn to the voice or to the quiet behind it. I've written to you as someone hidden, and now I wonder if you'd still hear me if I stood in front of you. Elara, what if we were never meant to be a mystery? What if I came to you, without petals, without riddles, just with the hope of being known? Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a confession. It was a question. And not just any question, it was the kind that unraveled gently, the kind that made everything else fall into hush. Maeve arrived later and found Alara still holding the letter. The tea had gone cold. The shop remained quiet, except for the soft rustle of wind against the windows. You got something, Maeve said, sliding off her gloves. Alara nodded. Yes. And? They want to be seen, she whispered. Really seen. Maeve didn't ask who they were. She just smiled softly and placed her hand on Alara's shoulder. Then maybe it's time, she said. Maybe it's time you opened the garden gate. That night, Ilara didn't go to the alley with a reply. She didn't write anything at all. Instead, she set a tiny card on the jasmine's pot. It read, "Yes, I was always listening to the silence. Come when you're ready. I will be too." She placed a single sprig of eucalyptus beside it and turned off the lights. Chapter 7, The Bloom Between Words. It happened on a Thursday. The kind of Thursday that held its breath, sky draped in heavy clouds that never quite rained. The air was hushed, but not hollow. It was the kind of stillness that suggested something was about to unfold, though it didn't say what. Allura had arrived at Fleur before sunrise, not out of habit, but something quieter. Instinct, maybe. She flicked on the pendant lights one by one, their golden glow softening the sleepy gloom. The air smelled of lavender and pine from the wreath Maeve had crafted the day before. The shop felt like the inside of a memory, waiting to be remembered. She set the kettle on and sat by the window. She didn't know if Ivy would come. But today felt like a day he could. She told him she was ready. No petals, no riddles, just the quiet behind the voice, the breath between the words, the shape of presence. And she meant it. Maeve entered quietly, noticing the change immediately. "Alara," she said gently, placing her scarf on the hook, "you look like someone waiting at a train station, but without a timetable." Alara smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting with both warmth and uncertainty. "That's exactly how it feels." Maeve walked past her to water the orchids. "Well," she said with a wink, "sometimes the train does come." It was late morning when the shop bell rang. Not the rush of a customer, not the distracted shuffle of someone seeking a bouquet out of guilt or routine. This sound was slow, intentional, like someone choosing to walk through a threshold. Alara looked up. He was taller than she'd imagined. His coat was dark navy, brushed with rain that hadn't quite fallen. A canvas satchel hung at his side. His shoes were muddy at the soles, the kind that had walked somewhere meaningful. But what caught her most, what rooted her still, was not the outer frame. It was his face. There was no grand mystery to it, no cinematic entrance. But his eyes, soft gray, tinged with quiet, held a familiar hush, a silence she had been answering without knowing. He stood just inside the door, not quite smiling, not quite speaking. "Ilara?" he asked, voice low, uncertain. She nodded. "You're Ivy," she said. Not a question, just a truth unfolding. He stepped forward. "My name is Lucian." She tasted the name silently, like a petal on her tongue. Lucian. I didn't expect you to look ordinary, she said, then winced. I mean that kindly. He chuckled. I hoped you would. I've spent too long trying not to be seen. It's strange to be looked at. There was a pause. It wasn't awkward, just spacious. Ilara gestured toward the wooden table in the corner of the shop, where dried lavender hung above and a small lamp spilled warm light onto stacked journals. He did. She brewed 2 cups of tea without asking how he liked it. Some things were better decided in silence. They didn't speak of flowers. Not yet. Lucian told her he'd once been a school teacher. Literature. Poetry. He said he stopped teaching after losing someone. He didn't say who. He said he'd come to the city to disappear, but the more invisible he became, the more he longed to be found. And then one morning, he passed Fleur and saw a woman arranging peonies with a kind of reverence that broke something open in him. So I wrote a letter, he said, watching the steam rise from his cup. Not expecting anything, not even planning to leave it. Ilara tilted her head. But you did. I did. And I answered. He looked at her then. Really looked. You did more than answer, Lucian said. You listened. The day passed in pieces. No grand confessions, no declarations of love. Just 2 people inching towards something that felt less like a beginning and more like an acknowledgement that they had already begun. Lucian stayed until the light thinned and the last customer left with a bundle of thistle and wild rose. Ilara walked him to the door. Outside, the sky had turned the color of faded plum. Streetlights blinked on like eyes opening one by one. He turned to her. Can I see you again? Without letters? She nodded. You already are. He smiled. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in linen. He handed it to her. Inside, a pressed bluebell. For courage, he said quietly. Not because you need it, but because you deserve to know you have it. That night, Ilara sat by her window with the bluebell in her lap. The jasmine curled around her wrist as if listening. She didn't speak. She didn't write. She simply sat there and let the presence of a new story take root beside her. The letters had been seeds. But now something was blooming. Chapter 8, Petals of Unspoken Truths. The wind that wandered into the city that morning smelled like something from another place, salted with the sea, perhaps, or dusted with pine. It rustled the petals of Ilara's window boxes, like the wind chimes on the awning of Fleur, and whispered against the pages of her open journal like it was reading along. Lucian had not written since their meeting, nor had he come back. But strangely, Ilara didn't feel abandoned. She felt paused, as though the story was still being written somewhere off-page. She watched the light slide down the front of the bakery across the street. The world seemed in soft motion, like the gentle swaying of poppies in a field. Something had changed within her, not suddenly, but steadily, like water eroding stone into grace. She hadn't always known how to name feelings, but she could feel them bloom inside her with the clarity of color. There was lavender for stillness, marigold for the unexpected, and now rose, full, heady, and impossible to ignore. Maeve arrived late, cheeks flushed and hair undone from the wind. She held a baguette in one hand and a newspaper in the other. Why do I feel like the world is trying to tell me something, and I'm too busy brushing my teeth to listen? She sighed, plopping into the shop's rattan chair. Alara chuckled. That's just called being human. Maeve squinted at her. You're smiling with your whole soul today. Is it Ivy? Lucien, Alara corrected gently. And no, he hasn't come back. Maeve arched a brow. So what's the glow? Alara looked down at her hands, palms open. I think I'm just not afraid anymore. That counts for something. The door creaked open shortly before noon, but it wasn't Lucien. It was Mrs. Alder from the antique shop next door. She brought with her a small, square envelope the color of sun-bleached linen. No return address, she said, laying it on the counter like something fragile. But I know his handwriting. It's a beautiful kind of sad. Ilara's breath caught. She recognized the curve of the E before she opened it. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter. Ilara? I didn't mean to disappear. I've spent my life hiding in stories, but you were the first person who read me without skipping pages. I want to tell you everything, the things I've never told anyone, the grief I've carried, the reasons I became Ivy in the first place. But before I can, I need to show you something. A place, actually. Meet me at the Botanical Conservatory, tomorrow, noon. Lucien. The ink had smudged in the bottom corner. A fingerprint, she guessed. Something about that made the letter feel more real. Like a touch through the page. The next morning was crystalline. Alara wore her mother's gold locket, the one shaped like a teardrop but held laughter within. She packed a flask of rose tea and took the long way to the conservatory, passing the bookstore where she'd first left a poem for a stranger, not knowing he would one day give her a name to speak out loud. The conservatory was quiet. Sunlight poured through the glass dome, casting mosaic shadows over the tiled paths. Ferns curled like secrets, and orchids clung to stone like memories. Lucien stood at the far end, near a flowering tree that spilled white petals onto the ground like snow. He turned before she called his name, as if he'd felt her. Ilara. She walked toward him, pulse steady. I kept wondering, he said, if I should explain everything or just be still beside you. Sometimes stillness is explanation, she said, smiling. He nodded, voice low. I need to tell you about her. Alara didn't flinch. Her. He motioned to a bench beneath the tree. Sit with me? They did. And then he began. She was my fiancée, Lucian said, eyes focused on the petals at his feet. Camille. She loved wisteria and cloudberries. She believed the world was better than it acted. She used to say people carry gardens inside them, they just forget to water them. Alara didn't speak. She let the words unfold like roots. We were together for 6 years. She was a music teacher. Soft voice, kind soul. We had plans. And then the diagnosis. His hands twisted gently in his lap. She asked me not to fall apart, but I did. Slowly, quietly. After she passed, I didn't know how to be Lucian anymore, so I became someone else. I became Ivy. He looked up at her, eyes raw but calm. And then your letter came. You called me back to myself. Alara reached out and took his hand. Grief changes us, she whispered, but it doesn't unmake us. He smiled, bittersweet. You make me feel like I still have roots. You do, she said, and maybe it's time to plant something again. They sat in silence, the garden breathing around them. A soft wind lifted a handful of petals into the air. They spun between them like small, white miracles. Later, as they walked beneath an archway of ivy and trailing jasmine, Lucian paused. Do you believe in second blooms? He asked. Alara glanced at him, sunlight streaking his face in gold. I do, she said, but I think they only come when we stop pretending the first bloom never fell. He exhaled, slow and full. Then maybe this, he whispered, is the season for it. She didn't reply. She only took his hand in hers, lightly, without force, and they walked into the soft hush of a new beginning. Together, Chapter 9, The Garden of Unspoken Promises. The garden was different now. Not because of the plants, though the roses had bloomed, deep crimson and wild, their petals curling like secrets, and not because of the sunlight, which streamed through the heavy glass of the conservatory with a golden, unwavering certainty. It was different because Alara had found something unexpected in its silence, a peace that didn't demand explanation, a rhythm that hadn't been there before, as though the earth itself had decided it was time to slow its breathing, just for a while. Lucian had come back, Not as the man who carried shadows of another life, but as someone who was learning how to let the light filter through. She could see it in the way his eyes no longer darted away from hers, the way his hands no longer fidgeted with the corners of his jacket when they spoke, the way he stood beside her, not as a figure waiting to disappear into the distance, but as someone willing to remain, to be present. There were no grand declarations, no promises made aloud. Yet, every gesture, every glance, every shared silence spoke volumes, and in their quiet moments, Ilara felt more alive than she ever had before. She wondered, as they walked together through the fragrant rows of flowers, if love always felt like this, a soft unfolding, a delicate invitation to stay. That evening, as the golden hour bathed the shop in a warm, honeyed glow, Alara sat by the window, arranging a bouquet of lavender and jasmine. The soft, familiar scent filled the air, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The letter Lucienne had given her weeks ago, pressed between the pages of her journal, felt like a distant echo now, a reminder of the uncertainties that had once clouded her heart. She had given him space, and he had given her time. And in that time, she realized something quiet and profound. It wasn't just the flowers that needed nurturing. It wasn't just the arrangements that brought meaning to the shop. It was the way she had come to care for him, for the parts of him that still wore the remnants of grief like a cloak, but that were slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to shed it. Her own heart had opened, too, tentatively, as a flower might, and now it seemed to be unfurling toward something that felt like warmth. And yet there were questions that remained, quiet questions buried beneath the surface of every word they exchanged. Questions about the future, about the past, about the seeds they were planting together, whether they would bloom or wither in the face of what they both carried. Maeve came in just as Alara finished the last arrangement, her arms full of parcels and shopping bags. I swear, I need a team to help me haul all this stuff back to my flat, Maeve said, setting the bags down on the counter with a dramatic sigh. Have you decided what you're doing tonight? I'm having dinner with Mark and thought you might want to join. Elora smiled, tying a ribbon around the stems of the bouquet. I think I'm going to stay here tonight. Maeve raised an eyebrow. Staying in for the night? With what? You've barely had a night alone since... She stopped herself, but the meaning was clear. Elara didn't react, but inside she could feel the gentle ache of longing stirring again. She hadn't seen Lucien in 2 days, and the absence of his presence felt like a soft ache she didn't know how to soothe. Well, don't stay cooped up here too long, Maeve said, her tone light, but there was an understanding in her eyes. I know you. You'll drive yourself mad in this place if you don't let someone in. Elara nodded, but as Maeve turned to leave, she felt a sudden resolve settle over her. Perhaps it was time to let the garden speak for her. The evening was still when she left the shop, locking the door behind her. The world outside had softened beneath the blanket of twilight, streets bathed in silver from the pale glow of the street lamps. It was quiet in a way that only the late evening could be, as if the whole city was holding its breath. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness as she made her way to the small cafe at the corner, the one where she and Lucien had first met. The doorbell chimed softly as she stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the place welcoming her. But Lucien wasn't there. For a moment, she felt the sting of disappointment, but then she reminded herself he had to be where he was needed. He was not a person to chase or be chased. He was learning, like her, how to stand still. And stillness, she realized, was as much a part of love as the blooming. She was just about to turn away when she saw him. Lucien stood near the back of the cafe, staring out the window. He had a book in his hands, but his eyes weren't on the pages. His thoughts seemed to be far away. Elara approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but as if drawn by something deeper than thought itself. Lucien turned his head. "Elara," he said, his voice soft but filled with something unspoken. She smiled, that familiar warmth flooding her chest. "I was just passing by. I thought I'd stop in." He looked at her for a long moment, as though seeing her for the first time in a while. His gaze softened. "I'm glad you did." Elara sat across from him, the familiar smell of coffee and cinnamon wrapping around them. "I was thinking," he began, his voice tentative, "about how much we don't say. How many things we just let sit between us, unspoken." She nodded, resting her hands on the table. "Some things take time to bloom," she said gently. He smiled then, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I think we're both learning that." Elara felt the weight of his words settle into her, deep in the marrow of her bones. "It's a strange kind of love," she said, "one that doesn't shout but whispers in the quiet spaces." Lucian's smile deepened. "Maybe that's the kind of love that lasts." She reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Maybe." Outside, the wind picked up again, stirring the leaves of the trees along the street. The air smelled of rain, of earth, and fresh beginnings. The world seemed to tilt toward something else, something inevitable, and Elara could almost feel it, the garden of unspoken promises beginning to grow. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were both ready to tend it. Chapter 10. The Bloom of Forever. The first light of dawn crept through the window, soft and quiet, as though the world itself was still hesitant to wake fully. Elara stood by the glass, the pale glow of the morning brushing her face with the gentlest of touches. It was as if the earth was stretching itself awake, just like she was. She hadn't slept much the night before. She couldn't. The thoughts that had filled her mind, of Lucien, of the letters, of everything they had shared, had kept her wide-eyed in the darkness as the silence of the shop wrapped around her like a blanket. The air in the conservatory smelled faintly of jasmine and roses, the last of the night's coolness clinging to the flowers, as if they too were holding on to something precious. The garden outside, the one she had tended to with such care, had become something more than just a space filled with blooms and thorns. It had become a reflection of what she had learned, the beauty of what could happen when things were left to grow at their own pace, when love was nurtured with patience and quiet understanding. The doorbell of the shop chimed softly as the first customer of the day entered. It was Maeve, as always, with that unmistakable energy that filled every room she entered. Her face broke into a smile when she saw Alara standing by the window, a soft light touching her profile. "You look like you've been up for hours," Maeve teased, setting a coffee cup down on the counter with a wink. "I figured I'd bring you your morning fix." Alara smiled, the warmth of the coffee in her hands grounding her, but there was something more profound about the moment. "I've been thinking, Maeve," she began, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of something long held. "About love. About what it means. I used to think it was something I could control, something I could plant, grow, and care for in just the right way. But love isn't something that obeys the rules. It doesn't grow in the straight lines we want it to." Maeve raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "And now?" Alara turned toward the window, her gaze unfocused, as if she were speaking more to the view outside than to Maeve herself. "Now, I understand that love is like the flowers. It has its own rhythm, its own time. Sometimes it blooms in ways you least expect, and sometimes it requires you to trust that, even when it seems fragile, it's strong enough to endure." "That sounds very philosophical," Maeve said with a small chuckle. "Did Lucien put you up to this?" Alara shook her head, a small laugh escaping her lips. "No, this is all me. For once, I think I'm starting to understand it." Lucien hadn't come by the shop the day before, or the day before that, but Alara wasn't worried. She wasn't even anxious anymore. Her heart was full, and she had come to understand the quiet rhythm of their connection. They both needed space, time to breathe, to let things grow without the pressure of expectations. The love they shared was rooted in trust, in the silent understanding that sometimes you simply needed to wait for the petals to open in their own time. As the morning progressed, more customers trickled in, their voices a hum in the background, a reminder of the world outside of Alara's small sanctuary. She worked in the quiet space between their conversations, her hands moving with the ease of someone who had found peace in their calling. It was mid-afternoon when the bell above the door chimed again. This time there was no mistaking the presence that entered the shop. Lucien. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her, and Alara felt the familiar warmth spread through her chest at the sight of him. His gaze softened as he stepped forward, the weight of the past few days lifting with each step. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, his voice carrying a quiet affection. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No," Alara replied softly, her heart swelling in the space between them. "You're exactly where you should be." He smiled then, that rare, unguarded smile that she had come to love. It was a smile that held everything, fragility, strength, and hope, all at once. The day passed in a soft blur, the hours slipping by as they worked side by side, sharing unspoken glances and quiet moments. There was no need for grand declarations. The simple act of being together, of tending to the garden, of arranging flowers with care, spoke volumes. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the conservatory, Alara stepped outside into the garden. Lucien followed her, his presence as steady and reassuring as the earth beneath their feet. They stood together, side by side, looking at the roses that had bloomed in the last few days, their deep red petals opening wide to the sky. It was as if the flowers themselves understood the language of love, how it could be gentle and fierce, patient and passionate, all at once. I used to think love was something you could plant, something you could control, Elara said, her voice barely above a whisper. But now I know that love is a garden of its own. You can't force it. You can only tend to it, trust it, and let it grow in its own time. Lucian's hand found hers, his touch warm, grounding. "And what if it takes a lifetime to bloom?" he asked, his voice low, filled with something tender and unspoken. Elora turned to face him, her heart swelling with the quiet certainty that had come with time. "Then I will wait. We will wait. And it will be worth it." They stood there for a long moment, the world around them still and peaceful. The garden, the shop, the air, all of it felt like a promise. A promise that, while love may not always be easy, it was worth every moment of care and patience. And as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Alara realized that sometimes the most beautiful things were the ones that took their time to bloom. The love she hadn't planted had grown nonetheless, deep, steady, and true. And this time, it was a love that would endure.